Hello, I want to ask you if you would, for a moment, be reflective. I've got a couple of questions to ask you to consider. What was your first memory of disability? What was the first time you encountered disability that you can actually say, oh, I remember? Now, as soon as I say that, your mind is off and running to fetch that memory. So I want to explain how, oops. Yeah, there we go. How your reference point comes to bear on the talk that I'm going to give tonight, and perhaps maybe how it will come to bear on the whole idea of sparking a conversation on disability studies in higher education. So if you're under the age of 25, in all likelihood, you had peers in your elementary classrooms who had disabilities. They were visibly disabled, some were invisibly disabled, but you grew up next to and with kids with disabilities. You may have had the topic brought up in your coursework. Others might have more experience because disability is a more prevalent component of our communities. And in thinking about that, I want to ask you to just reflect on the fact of when you encounter disability in the community, do you engage that person? Do you talk to them? Do you feel like you can just have a simple exchange? And chances are that most of us do not know how to do that with any great comfort. We don't know why, but I'm going to explain a little bit about that. There are models for understanding disability that you may not even know you know, but you're actually following implicitly. The medical model is basically the default model. It's how we've come to understand disability in the world, whether you intend it or not. The social model is another model I'm going to talk about tonight, but there's also the feminist model and the rights model to consider. The medical model writes disability on the body. So we look at the body and determine whether it's a problem body or problem mind. That's what disability means. It's troubled against norms of ability. That's the science part of how we've come to understand disability. That whole science and research industry that's grown up around detecting disability, or as I tell my students, the hunt for disability. When you're a teacher in school, you're out to find disability. Even the word itself, can make us somewhat uncomfortable. So it seems pretty self-evident, right, that disability is going to be on the body. What I'm going to talk to you, though, about is the fact that medicine then informs psychology, that medical model informs education, that medical model informs rehabilitation psychiatry. Again, you say, well, yeah, okay, that's true. But think about when disability appears in psychology. It is abnormal. Psychology. You study abnormality, you study defect, you study disorder. No surprise you do the same thing in education. Education is considered the space where we look for disability to make sure that we have a program that's set up for that individual child, whether it's general education or special education. Psychiatry, the same issue of the problem mind. However, most recently, there's been a lot of new conversation about disability and new conversation about medicine in the form of integrative medicine. Rita Sharon at Columbia University describes narrative medicine, and that is a growing field. Bradley Lewis at New York University and I were on a panel not too long ago where he was describing his work informed by Rita Sharon in what he calls narrative psychiatry, where the stories of that individual's perception of their disability comes into play in the clinical training of individuals who are going to become psychiatrists. I do the same in education. I ask for teachers to understand that there is a story that's being sold to you or told to you about education. And it may not necessarily be the romanticized story of education that you thought you were going to buy into. Most recently, disability studies has raised the bar for understanding disability through the arts, literature, architecture, philosophy, design. Prior to this moment in time, that has not been a conversation. So earlier when I asked you, And I showed the slide, the image of To Kill a Mockingbird. How many of you were taught to read disability in that novel? It's a very significant theme in the book, along with race, along with class, and in fact, it's an intersectional analysis for Boo Radley, for the characters in that book at that time. Disability studies is then an interdisciplinary field of study that explores disability through a cultural lens. So whereas the book To Kill a Mockingbird did not necessarily discuss the ideas of disability, they're there, you can go back and check into it. Today we can talk about disability in ways that we haven't because we're using a cultural lens. So we introduced models of understanding. I just showed you some new vocabulary and new ways to think about disability in the 21st century. It is a changing topic. So I'm offering a critique. And this critique is, as Michel Foucault has described this, it does not consist in saying that things are not good the way they are. It consists in seeing what type of assumptions, of familiar notions, of established unexamined ways of thinking on the accepted practices are based. So when we started, I asked you to think about disability. I would hazard to guess that many of you are informed about disability from that medicalized notation of disability. The social model basically asks that you separate impairment from the context. And this is where I want you to kind of grasp that this is a new idea. Not every disability is visible. And yet, we look at spaces where physical obstacles are built within in the built environment structure exclusion, so that some bodies and some minds are favored over others by design. This is the kind of sort of the gist of what I want you to think about. We are excluding individuals by design when we create these kinds of structures. True, the structures may have been built in an era when we didn't talk about disability and we did not expect that disability was going to show up on our campus. But keep in mind that that was also the same time in which we did not expect that people of color or women or people who could not afford to come to college would be in university settings like this. So physical and social barriers, attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions produce disability. It's the production of disability that is centrally a new idea informed by disability studies. And you could ask yourself the same thing. Are there physical barriers that produce racism? Yeah, we're learning about them quite a lot. Are there barriers, attitudes, beliefs, and assumptions that produce racism, classism, sexism? Those all operate in very similar ways. Ableism is one of the terms that comes out of this critique of society that has privileged some bodies over others. Ableism is the unearned privilege afforded to the able-bodied. So I hope you'll take the test and pass on your way out tonight. You have to define what is ableism or you don't get a sandwich. Very simply, it's much more complex than that, but the most simple definition is to think about the fact that some bodies have access to some spaces while others do not. And those spaces are not just physical spaces. It operates in society in many of the same ways that we lay out our critiques for racism, classism. It's systemic oppression. That doesn't make you a systemic oppressor, but if you think in those terms, you're coming to grasp the ideas of what is systemic or structural oppression. Microaggressions in the example of ableism are evident in the everyday lives of disabled people. If you walk through the world with people with disabilities, you are experiencing some of what is referred to as a microaggression. Your friends go into the restaurant in the front door. You go through the alley and past the toilet paper that's stacked up beside the bathroom to get to the same spot that everybody else is. In a setting where it's not about the physical access or lack of physical access, you're looking at perhaps entering a classroom where it would be really great if you could just listen to the professor, but not listen and write. CART technology allows the display of lectures so that while someone is talking, those words are up on the board, or up on a whiteboard, up on a wall somewhere in the classroom, and the individual leaves. There's a transcript at the end. So that's the kind of technology that some individuals who have disability written invisibly on their body require in order to access the spaces that most of us don't need. How many of you would benefit, however, from leaving a lecture and having a transcript at the door the next day, later that same moment? That's how that happens. So despite laws and social policies designed to support disabled people, ableism legitimizes prejudice against people with disabilities. So that's the sort of who's authoring this prejudice. Unfortunately, ableism is an institutional feature of public schooling. It exists in terms of normalcy, student inadequacy, deficiency, the practices of segregation. While as I showed you the image early in the film from Dan Habib's documentary, including Samuel, his son is sitting next to a child with disabilities. And that image is not necessarily uniform in public schools. Typically, kids with disabilities are down the hall, down the next hall, and at the end of the next hall. And instead of having Miss Jackowitz's classroom, they have SPED written on the door. Fourth grade children understand the difference. They do not want to say they are in SPED. They know this. So these are the kinds of things that, despite legislation and laws, we have been able to institutionalize in education. There's a lack of student voice in shaping students' educational programs. And that voice doesn't mean that the student sits down and goes through a program planning with their teacher and says, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that. But the voice itself is really important when I'm teaching teachers about thinking about how disability studies informs what you're going to be doing in a classroom. I describe a student who was removed from an assembly like this because the bus came and the assembly was running late and the paraprofessionals had to remove the child forcibly from an arena where he had no voice in staying until the program was over like everyone else. So did he have a meltdown? Yes, he had a meltdown. Were there 200 children's eyes on him as he was being dragged out of the auditorium? Yes, absolutely. That's a lesson on how we move away from understanding disability. So disability studies in education assumes competence and rejects deficit models of disability. We begin, those of us who are in disability studies, we begin with the idea that individuals with disabilities are competent. They can write their futures. They must be permitted to do this. And that is a big, big leap from reality for a lot of what happens to kids with disabilities in schools. There's a new critical merger that's been in the making, and as I noted early on, there are critiques that have evolved over time around sexism, and yet today we're looking at why there's a disparity between men and women's incomes. Okay, we know that change is slow. However, some of the conversations that are going on now specific to disability studies and critical race theory are going to explode what happens in schools in many, many ways. We are going to light a spark here in higher education, but the actual explosion is going to happen in public schools because we have so much data that show the overrepresentation of students of color in special education, defined as I do, as a site that's problematic. It's a site where kids are held against their will for purposes that have been neither socially valued nor medically appropriate. We are not going to cure children of disabilities. We need to cure ourselves in order to live with disability. So disability in higher education, that's where we are. I ask the question because my students have asked the question of me. Once they understand in context this critique, the next step is to look locally. Yay, we want them to do that. They look locally and they ask, does this university, does the town I live in, the community I'm from, do we consider disability as part of diversity? I ask the question, well, we must, right? We recruit from New York City to make sure that we have certain types of diversity. Do we recruit disabled students who have been in public schools, working to completion? Is that part of who we want to go down and recruit? to have up here in our campus. If we view disability from a value-added perspective that informs the learning experience and essential to all of our lives as a community, if we did that, we would have disabled people in our classes competing along with us for understanding, and we would not have to find them in spaces that are removed from the general milieu of the class and school and building and community. Many of you know the answer to that. We're working on it, right? We're going to try to get there. So I'm asking really that we look at disability as more than a concern of whether institutions have the legal right to defend what they've done by excluding individuals with disabilities, to turn that around and say, what is this space going to gain by having new bodies, new faces, new places, new ways to think about what we do? And that is literally the charge I'm hoping to lead here at Geneseo, to organize beyond the boxes that you check off by race, class, gender, or disability. Move right past that, and let's get into what happens when we have different responses to the material that we teach. That we need to be able to have as many opportunities for students to succeed as possible. And I am notorious for this. I'm still negotiating what are going to be the completion projects for my semester with students, because I'm invested in their success, and I'm modeling that. I want to model that for them. So to conclude, I want you to think of, this is a line from Mandarati Roy, who's an artist and activist from India. So she's not really talking about ableism, but she's talking about oppression. She's talking about systemic oppression. That once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you've seen it, keeping quiet, saying nothing, becomes as political an act as speaking out. There is no innocence. Either way, you're accountable. Thank you.